Greetings. This is Adjunct Professor Panu Pihkala from University of Helsinki, speaking about rituals as a response to climate distress. Warm greetings from Helsinki. Here is an example of a ritual, not for climate problems, but for environmental issues. This took place a little bit west of Helsinki, Espoo, an old-growth forest near Vitresk, a famous manor of Finnish architects, was cut down in 2015, and I was personally leading a kind of funeral ritual for the old-growth forest, and this picture is from there. I have written about that and other forms of ritualizing ecological grief in the insightful and striking volume edited by Hannah Malcolm, an Anglican theologian, called Words for a Dying World, Stories of Grief and Courage from the Global Church. That volume includes several reflections also on various kinds of ritual elements. Even more, I've written about this in Finnish, which I do realize that not too many people internationally can read, but the algorithms and artificial intelligence are nowadays quite good at translating these. So if you want to read more with some help of AI, here's a link to that rituals and eco-anxiety piece. A second example that I'll mention in the beginning is called Silentopia. It's a Finnish art project which comprised of modern dance and music in a way where the dancers and musicians worked in a symbiotic relationship. Some of Australian environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht's ideas were applied here. I personally also served as an advisor for the project, which had the explicit aim of engaging with ecological emotions through art, performance, and elements of ritual. That was quite interesting project indeed, and the feedback from the audiences in Finnish big cities was generally highly positive. So there was something very powerful in the act of coming together and using creative methods to engage with these topics. So is Silentopia a ritual? That's a complex question. I would prefer to use the noted ritual scholar Ronald Grimes's frame, where he talks about elements of ritual in many kinds of human behavior. So instead of spending a lot of time in this presentation about defining ritual, I'm taking a broader approach and observing how elements of ritual might be useful in engaging with climate distress and other climate emotions. For arts and creativity and performance and ritual, this is one insightful article by Jennifer Adams, and you can find it online. Some of the key points in my talk. Rituals or elements of ritual are an important way to engage with climate distress and various climate emotions. The scope can be broad and include also emotions about other environmental issues. So often these two resonate together, more explicit climate emotions and then more broader ecological emotions. Because rituals are embodied and holistic, they help to engage with emotions in our so-called body minds, in the combinations of our bodies and minds which have intricate connections. And that I see as a great power in elements of ritual. Rituals give space for combinations of emotions often. They can express, for example, guilt, grief, and hope at the same time or in different parts of the ritual activity. And this I also see as an important resource for engaging with the complicated affective dimensions of contemporary ecological crisis, which is also a socio-ecological crisis. I'll start with some observations about climate distress and climate emotions. Here are some recent books. Either they have just been published now in spring 2024, or they are forthcoming as the book on the left. I have a chapter in each of these books actually. So there are observations about various climate emotions here, and especially in the middle book about climate sorrow or climate grief. The book on the right is more related to various educational events, but some of the methods there, like my chapter on mind map of climate or eco-emotions, can be used in a wide variety of settings. The book on the left includes a chapter I wrote about climate distress. Different languages have different terms for climate distress or climate anxiety or angst. These terms also have different nuances for various people, which should be recognized, and there can be identity politics and various kinds of connotations for these terms, so it can be a loaded terrain. But a fundamental point is that there is a lot of various kinds of climate distress in the world, and this often remains half hidden under the surface. My main field nowadays is interdisciplinary environmental research. I have a history in studying religion and environment, and more explicitly also Christian environmental theology. But in my work over the last 10 years, I have participated in many kinds of studies about people's eco-emotions and climate emotions. And the result is that there are a lot of them, but it's complicated, and people are not always in touch with these emotions or their distress or the cause of their distress. Different frameworks can help to understand this. One is disenfranchised grief, coming from Kenneth Doka and others in grief studies, meaning grief which is not given public voice or recognition or validation. There can be socially constructed silence. People stay silent about matters which they think and feel are too difficult. And one may use also the frame of socially organized defenses here if one wants, because the contradictions between the threats of climate crisis and the lack of reactions to them are so strong. But public rituals can work against all of these. They provide witness and testimony in the public sphere. They can give validation to disenfranchised emotions such as grief. They can also deal with the complications around climate guilt, for example, and they work against socially constructed silence and defenses. My chapter in the book, whose cover was shown in an earlier slide, is here. And then I want to mention a bit about the wide variety of climate emotions. So this is a climate emotion wheel published in 2024 by Climate Mental Health Network organization. I was part of the working group, and they used much of my research when doing this. This has been translated into roughly 15 languages at this point, including German. And here you can see some major climate emotions, not all of them, but some, and then some categorizations or typifications which are not to be taken too literally. Really, the idea here is just to help people observe various climate emotions in themselves and in others. And if we think about climate distress, it's easy to see that a lot of these emotions may have connections with that. The wheel can be used in various ways when working with people, and I encourage that. Also on that same website is a brand new short guide to climate emotions, which I wrote with the help of Anja Kamenets. There are reflection questions and other material related to this. And this finally is the research article which was used as a basis for the wheel. This process model is something that I will not talk a lot in this presentation because it would take more time, but I'm just mentioning that there is this conceptualization of people's journeys in relation to what is here called eco-anxiety and ecological grief, meaning situations and processes where people engage with the ecological crisis in the world. So there are chronological stages unknowing, semi-consciousness, then possible awakenings and shocks leading into complicated process of trying to adjust and transform. And I'm conceptualizing on the basis of interdisciplinary research 3 dimensions: action, grieving, and distancing, which seem to be elementary for people so that they could adjust and transform. And if a person does only one of these, then there's the danger of getting into this background terrain of stronger distress or anxiety or depression. And this has many links also for the topic of rituals and climate distress. And I wanted to show this. You can find more information online. But more explicitly, talking about pastoral care, climate distress, and ritual, there are various aspects here. There are collective rituals, sometimes explicitly organized to engage with certain climate emotions. Then there can be encouragement for people to create their own rituals or activities which have elements of ritual. For example, creating some kind of altar or memorial or shrine personally, and then encouraging people to creatively engage with their climate emotions through that kind of process. So arts and creative methods can offer a lot here, and the borders between arts and spirituality are quite porous indeed. Then there can be ritual elements in climate action, for example, in demonstrations. And I know that in the conference where this presentation is shown, there are going to be talks about that also. There's a need to be careful in planning these, I think. For example, how much is it possible to be vulnerable with climate grief as part of a demonstration? And I think that we need both inclusion of climate emotions in public action and demonstrations, but we also need specific safe spaces for deeper engagement with some of the difficult issues, because it's not always easy or safe to do that in public spaces. Scholars Mihai and Thaler have published a very insightful paper on environmental commemoration, where they discuss principles that in their view should guide environmental commemoration, which can include various kinds of elements of ritual. And these, in brief, are the 5 principles they offer. Multi-species justice. So not just anthropocentric, but also paying attention and due to the destinies of other species and interrelationality. Then responsibility, and with this they mean also engaging with the balance between individual responsibility and the need for structural change and the uneven distribution of climate emotions, for example. So, for example, an application of this is that rituals which deal with climate guilt shouldn't just be individualistic. They should have a collective dimension, and they should have links with moral outrage about climate matters, so that it's not proposed that everybody would have equal culpability for these issues. By pluralism, they refer to a wide variety of practices, including oral and embodied and so on. So having that in mind and being open to various forms. Dynamism refers to staying open to what happens in the world. So it's linked to sort of proactive and reactive skills, of which I'll say a bit later. And then anti-closure also mentions a possible criticism against using rituals to engage with climate emotions, namely the question that whether that provides sometimes a problematic kind of closure. For example, people would find absolution or forgiveness for their climate guilt and then disregard the need for responsibility. Personally, I think that these kind of challenges can be overcome, and I find it very valuable that Mihai and Tyler also highlight the importance of what they call anti-closure when practicing environmental commemoration, and that can be linked with various other kinds of ritual activity too. So these kinds of 5 principles, and I warmly recommend reading their paper entirely. For hints and tips about some really closely related materials and practices, the work of American environmental author and workshop leader Treppe Johnson, I think, is very fruitful in this regard. She often uses various elements of ritual, and encountering wounded places, whether in cities or outside cities, is a main aspect of her work and the work done by others who use similar methods. Guerrilla beauty is a concept she uses. There's often creative work in the wounded places and then producing some kind of counter gift of beauty. For example, constructing a shape of a bird from materials found in the place. So it is easy to see that there's several elements of ritual here, like symbolic activity and embodied experience, often collective ones and so on. And sometimes there are liminal boundaries set between entering that wounded place and exiting it. So references here to anthropology and, for example, the liminality theory of Victor Turner. Radical Joy for Hard Times is the name of an international movement she has been creating. I warmly recommend engaging with that, and also a book with the same title. Remembrance Day for Lost Species is a broader international movement happening often on November 30th, and people are encouraged to collectively do rituals for environmental commemoration, and I think both guilt and grief often resonate in those rituals, and possibly often also hope. Work that reconnects movement by Joanna Macy and colleagues has been influential also in constructing various kinds of rituals. Here is a picture from the Radical Joy for Hard Times movement. If I'm summarizing some of the skills which I think are very much needed, it's ritual imagination, discussed, for example, by Francis Weller, a grief expert who has been leading also workshops on ecological grief. So being able to use imagination and creativity. And this is something that the ritual scholar Ronald Grimes also highlights. And this craft skills of doing together various kinds of rituals is important. It's good to be able to do that proactively. Remembrance Day for Lost Species can be one part of that. And then having reactive skills, I mean that when something happens which needs engagement with, then having ritual skills in the community would be important. Sometimes focusing on a certain climate emotion or eco-emotion, and sometimes intentionally engaging with many of them, I find very important also. So sometimes, for example, explicitly around climate guilt and sometimes explicitly around climate grief, but recognizing that these resonate with each other, and the importance of the affective landscape of moral outrage and this determination to work ethically and work for more sustainable and caring relations is, of course, elementary. What about rituals of relief after, for example, guilt and grief have been engaged with, even though it's a long process? So this is something that also the Radical Joy for Hard Times movement refers to with even its name, and something which I leave to you to think about. Some further sources are listed in these final slides. Theology of Eco-Anxiety has been written about in this book of contextual theology. Stephen Chase has offered spiritual practices, including elements of ritual for related issues. Then for pastoral care, I've written a couple of couple of academic articles, Eco-Anxiety and Pastoral Care, and an earlier piece which deals more explicitly with the Lutheran tradition. I have a history of doing a dissertation in ecumenics and environmental theology, so that can be found also. For forthcoming work, I've just now, during the last weeks and months, been writing 2 papers, which are very closely related to what I have been talking briefly about today. It's about engaging with climate grief, guilt and anger in religious communities, and also exploring frameworks in pastoral psychology or psychology of religion in relation to these topics. If you want to listen to more, we have an international podcast with noted environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty, provocatively titled Climate Change and Happiness, What Could Be a Good Life or Meaningful Life Amongst Climate Change. You can find this on the common podcast platforms. We often have guests, and then there's some contact information also here. So thank you for your attention. This was Panu Pihkala talking about rituals, climate distress and climate emotions, especially in the context of pastoral care and spiritual communities.